Hey there, this is Tam Pham, founder and CEO of Asian Efficiency. And today I have my co host, Brooks Duncan. How are you today?
I'm excellent. How are you, Tan?
I'm doing very well today. And I'm excited to kind of share and dive deeper into our writing process because we do a lot of writing at AE, but I don't think we've ever really revealed how we get so much writing done and how we do it so effectively and efficiently. So I'm excited to kind of share some of the workflows, tools, apps that we use that I think anyone could benefit from. But as always, before we start diving into today's content, we always like to share some of our top three favorite resources as of lately. So, Brooks, I'm going to give this one to you here today. Can you share them in 90 seconds or less?
Yeah, so our number one resource that I'll recommend is Grammarly. Now, disclaimer, they have been a sponsor of the podcast in the past. They're not sponsoring this episode, but we all use Grammarly here at Asian Efficiency and love it. It's an online tool that checks grammar, finds spelling mistakes. If you use the premium service, which I personally do, it'll give you grammar suggestions, help you be more accurate and succinct, and is a great tool. That's number one. Number two is some sort of book that has grammar suggestions and gives you grammar best practices. There's lots of great tools out there or great books out there, but the one that I like that I saw on my shelf is Grammar Girl's Quick and Dirty Tips for Better Writing. So that's by Mignon Fogarty, and that is a great book on writing. And number three is by a book by Stephen King, and it's called On Writing. Now, half of the book is kind of his life story and how his journey to become a writer. So if you don't care about that, you can ignore the first half of the book, but the second half is his tips on writing. And there's a concept that's famous from that book called kill your darlings, which means no matter how attached you are to a piece of text or a piece of writing, feel free to cut it out. The more succinct you can make it, the better. The more focused you can make it, the better. So that is my third tip on writing by Stephen King.
Yeah, so we'll have links to everything that we just shared in the show notes. So don't worry if you missed something, just swipe if you're listening to us in an app, or if you want to find the show notes online, you can always go to theproductivityshow.com/346. So we're going to be talking about our writing process here today. So if you're someone who wants to be a better writer, I think this episode is going to be perfect for you. If you want to be more efficient at it as well, of course, you are in the right place. And if you do a lot of longer form writing, this episode will give you some tips to make your writing more efficient and better as well. And even if you're not someone who's like, well, I don't consider myself a writer, I think you're going to benefit a lot from this because whether you realize it or not, everyone does a lot of writing, especially when we are in this remote work economy. A lot of us are writing emails, short form letters. So you will benefit from some of the tips and tools that we're going to be sharing with you here today. And if you're curious about next week's episodes, I'm really excited to share with you that next week's episode is all about how to get into a flow state so you can get more done in less time. So we're going to kind of debunk some of the myths around flow state and what you can do without the woo-woo practices, get into a flow state and get ultra focused. So here at Asian Efficiency, we do a lot of writing. Like I mentioned in the intro, we have over 600 blog posts on the website. That's close to over 1 million words. So we have done a lot of writing. And it does not just limit us to just blog posts. We've done a lot of scripts, whether it's for the podcasts, even the show notes. If you're a TPS Plus subscriber, you'll get access to some of our show notes. You can see there's a lot of writing that takes place there. We've created a lot of online courses, and as part of course materials, you have workbooks, you have introductions, you have technical manuals, you have other content pieces that are in there. We do so much writing, and so we wanted to kind of like reveal some of the things that we personally use that I think everyone would benefit from, because whether you realize it or not, everyone does a lot of writing. So even just implementing one or two tips that you take away from today's episode will make a big difference in your life, but also in your workflow as well. And Brooks, you and I have been talking about, writing, the writing process, but what do we actually mean by that?
Yeah, so this is something that we've refined over the years. But for us, when we think about writing internally, we really break it down into four main segments. There's the brainstorming phase, there's the research phase, there's the actual writing phase, and then there's the review and edit phase. And yeah, you could skip almost any of these phases, well, except the writing, I guess, but the other ones, you can skip them. None of them are required. However, to have truly effective writing, we really believe that you're going to get the best result if you follow all 4 of those phases. So what we thought we would do today is just go through our writing process, the 4 phases of our writing process, and kind of each talk about some of the things that we've learned over the years, and also some of the tips and the techniques we use personally to do each of these 4 phases. So we might as well start with number 1, which is the brainstorming phase. Now, this is actually something that I have refined over the years, and I didn't used to do too much brainstorming. Anytime I had to write something, this is going back to school or even professionally, I would just kind of like sit down. Of course, maybe you need to do some research, which we'll talk about, but the writing part I would just, sit down and like let the words flow. And whatever came out of my mind is what would make it down on the page or in the screen. And that was fine, but I found that the more time that I spend brainstorming ahead of time, this is like thinking through what I'm going to write, the writing process becomes way, way easier, and the result is much, much better. And whenever I struggle, whenever I'm like not happy with a piece of writing, or I just like get writer's block, people talk about writer's block, chances are it's because I skipped the brainstorming phase, or maybe I did like a not as good of job as brainstorming as I could have. So the way that I do brainstorming almost exclusively, like 100% of the time that I'm doing brainstorming, it's using mind mapping. That's the way I have found as more effective for me. Different people are going to have different techniques, but for me, almost any piece of writing of any significant size starts with a mind map. And we actually did a podcast all about mind mapping way back in TPS346. So if you want to learn more about the mechanics of mind mapping, you can check that podcast out. But basically what I do is I sit down and I brainstorm out the topics I want to make, the main points. I will drag trees around of the mind map to kind of like reorganize things. I just kind of like let things flow out. And I like mind maps, and you can mind map with paper. I like doing it electronically because you can just like really quickly bang things out. You can really easily move things around. And like I said, I don't just do this for long articles. Sometimes I'll even do it if I need to respond to, say, a detailed email or something like that. Anything that I want to think out, it starts with a mind map. So for myself, my tool of choice is an app called MindNode. Now that is a Mac and iOS tool. An alternative, if you're not a Mac user or an Apple user, is MindMeister. That's a really popular web-based cross-platform tool as well. I thought it might be helpful to show an example of what I'm talking about. Now, this is an audio podcast, so obviously that's not going to translate well. But if you go to the show notes at theproductivityshow.com/346, I will have a link to a mind map that I made to our blog post that we did about the Kindle, Amazon Kindle. And so you can check out what one of my brainstorming mind maps look like, and then you can check out the resulting article, and you can see kind of how they both line up. Sometimes the product, as you'll see from that example, sometimes the product doesn't exactly match up, but it always starts with a mind map. How about you, Tan? How do you brainstorm? What's your process for that?
When I think about brainstorming, I have to think about, do I actually know the topic, or am I brainstorming a topic? So if I'm just brainstorming what to write about, I love the idea of a mind map, just being able to kind of like line things up, and even just doing it on a whiteboard or just even pen and paper, just like jotting ideas down. Now, what we've done over the years and what I do all the time is I keep a running list of ideas of things to write about, so that when it comes to the brainstorming phase, oftentimes nowadays is just the process of looking at this running list and seeing, okay, what are all the ideas that I've collected over the years, and then just pick one of those to start writing about. However, if I already know what the topic is, then the brainstorming process is actually relatively easy. The way I kind of approach it is to cover as many angles, ideas, and points as possible. That's my variation of brainstorming. So for shorter pieces of content, it's simply a brain dump. It could be as simple as just putting it on a text file. I used to be I used to be a big mind mapper. However, nowadays I like to jot it down in just linear notes, especially if I know the topic really well. If I don't know the topic as well, then I will pull up a mind map every now and then, because it allows me to kind of just brainstorm and just brain dump in various different ways. But if I'm pretty familiar with the topic, I like to use linear notes and just jot down as many, again, angles, ideas, and points as much as possible. And so if I know that I'm going to be writing on overcoming procrastination or how to be more efficient in your work life, then since I'm pretty familiar with these kind of topics already, I know oftentimes what to talk about and what to write about, but maybe just discuss different angles or ideas that maybe will resonate. Because one of the things I've learned over the years is that you can say the same message, but if you can explain it through different stories, analogies, and different angles, it sometimes takes a few times before people really get it and makes the idea stick in their head. And so if you've been following Asian efficiency for over 10 years now, you see there's like a common theme of all the ideas that we kind of teach and talk about. However, we always like to approach it from different angles and topics so that you kind of get it crystal clear in your head. And so for me, again, it's just a really simple brain dump. If it's something that I'm familiar with, if it's something that I'm not as familiar with, then I will pull up a mind map.
Yeah, see, that's an interesting example how we both do the same thing. We both write the same things essentially, but tend to do it in quite a different way. We record these podcasts live with our dojo members or our TPS Plus members, which you can check out TPS Plus at theproductivityshow.com/plus. And Joel in the live stream says that he vacillates between linear notes and mind maps. He feels that it's easier to get started in a mind map. I would agree with that. But he finds that he finds it easier if he does linear notes to kind of like get going on it, because you've got the kind of hierarchy there. One thing that I like about mind notes specifically is you can start with a mind map, but then you can export it to different formats, including plain text. So you can kind of turn your mind map into a linear note hierarchy if that's something that you want to do. All right, so that is part number one of the workflow, is brainstorming. Let's move on to part number two, and that is researching. So you touched on this distinction, which I think is a very good distinction, about brainstorming things that you know about and brainstorming things that you don't know about. And that's where the research comes in. And the type of research that you do is going to be different based on the type of writing. Obviously, a book is going to be very different than a workbook, PDF, which is going to be different than a blog post, which is going to be different than, say, a marketing email or something like that. Obviously, that research you do is going to be different. And many writing tools, including some of the tools we're going to talk about in the next phase, actually has research tools built right in. You can collect all your research material right there alongside the writing that you do. So you can put notes, images, web links all together, which makes everything organized and referenceable. So Tan, I guess I started last time, so I'll start with you first. How do you do your research if it's something that is not a topic that you already know a lot about? What kind of research do you do, and how do you do it?
Yeah, I think an underrated part of research is actually way before you start the research process. And that is just reading a lot of books or listening to a lot of audiobooks. Because oftentimes the research that you do way before you ever start writing is just as valuable compared to just, opening up google.com and then typing in a few keywords to do your research there, right? Because when I'm reading books about, I don't know, evolutionary psychology or biology, or just the way like history works in certain eras and how people lived in certain time frames, all these different ideas kind of like over time, the more you start to consume all these different concepts and ideas, that is something that you can then use in your writing, and as you can start developing more ideas and flesh them out further. And so one of the things I would encourage people is just to continue to consume and learn, especially from valuable resources like books and audiobooks. And the other side of the research process is kind of like what I would like to call like the active part, where you actively seek out information as you're relating to the topic that you're going to be writing about. And a lot of people would, start with Google, and that's something I think everyone could start with. However, one of the things that I'm more interested about, or actually one of the things I'm more interested in nowadays as part of the research process, is actually going through forums and message boards. And the reason for that is you kind of get unfiltered problems, challenges, thoughts that people are having about a particular topic. So to give you an example, let's say I'm writing a post on overcoming procrastination for agent efficiency. I might then go to Reddit. I might go to Quora, which is an online forum. Uh, one of the things that we have, access to is the Dojo forum, right, where our Dojo members hang out, our private community. And so I will start to kind of like dig around, search for some keywords around procrastination or doing things last minute, which is something that people say often. And that's something I had to learn over time, is that a lot of times people don't use the word procrastination when they're describing a challenge that they're having. They'll say stuff like, oh, I do a lot of things last minute, which is essentially the same thing, but they use a different word. And I had to kind of learn to recognize that by just doing a lot of the research. And another underrated form of research is actually talking to a lot of people about this. So if you've ever talked to me on a call, which is not unusual, we do a lot of these calls with our clients and customers as a way to kind of like, give them coaching and feedback. But also it's a way for us to do more research to see what kind of language people use. And that's really the thing that I oftentimes look for the most, is what's the language that people use to describe a challenge or a problem that they're having, right? And that has so many other different benefits. Like if you use the right words, it starts to, one, resonate more with people if you describe a problem and challenge that they're having in the words that they're using. But also two, if people are searching for stuff on Google, it's easier to find your stuff if you're using the right words, right? So instead of saying, this is how you overcome procrastination, which is actually a word that a lot of people don't use themselves. They understand the concept of it, but they oftentimes don't use it. They'll again say stuff like doing things last minute, or I always put things off. Those are phrases that people actually use. And so you want to do some research around the language that people are using, because again, it makes your writing more relatable. So if you ever looked at the newsletters that I write, oftentimes they're not filled with like, technical words or anything like that. You can actually relate to oftentimes the stories and the ideas in there, because I use everyday language. And so that's one of the things I always look for, aside from the other things you'll be mentioning, Brooks, is just what's the language that people are using, and then figuring out what sort of thought pattern are they having, what are some of the things that are going on in their head. And so I like the idea of, how can I enter the conversation that people are already having in their heads? And that's kind of like what my research process is all about. And how do I speak to that? And once I can speak to that, then I can offer a solution or an idea or a suggestion that will allow people to say, yes, this is actually for me.
I love that. Yeah, that's a great reframe of thinking about when you're researching anything, thinking about the way people actually talk versus your preconceived notion. Rob has an interesting question in the live stream, which I hadn't really thought of, which is, he asks, do you limit the time in hours that you spend on research, or do you do research until you're completely familiar with the topic? He says, I can lose myself in research and gather more and more information. This is actually what I'll answer first. I don't actually have a set limit of time. However, this is one reason why I usually like to brainstorm first before doing research, which sounds kind of weird. But and of course, as you do research, your brainstorm, your mind map or outline, whatever it is going to change and grow. But one of the reasons why is I want to think about what I want to say first, and then do research that will flesh that out, versus trying to, this is me personally, trying to like learn everything possible about a certain topic, because 60% of the stuff you're reading and learning about that topic might have nothing to do with what it is you are trying to write and trying to accomplish. So I like to flip it around and work off a mind map or a brainstorm first. And that way I'm researching things to flesh out what I already want to say, versus just getting lost in the research, which can be really, really easy. How about you, Tan? Do you have like a cap to the amount that you research?
No, I wouldn't put myself on a cap. I think the natural cap that I have is that the fact that we work in sprints
Mm.
at our company. And so we have 2 weeks to do all these different tasks and things that we have to get done as a company. So that kind of like has a natural kind of like cadence to how much time we can spend on something. The other thing is when you try to limit yourself to a certain time frame, I find that the research quality is not always necessarily better. It just forces you to actually get stuff done a little bit faster. But it doesn't mean that the quality is always better. So I find there's like no relationship there or even correlation. And so I would just say, hey, if you have an hour of time to research, just say, okay, I'm going to spend an hour on it. And it might only take 20 minutes, right? But it could also take up to an hour. So if I had to average it out, I would say for a blog post, the amount of time researching is maybe 40 minutes, 45 minutes or so. I think that's a fair assessment for me. Again, very dependent on how familiar I am with the topic. If it's something like technical, like for example, your blog post on the Kindle, there could be a lot of things that could be breaking stuff down, like how the Kindle technology works and like how it syncs up with different tools and like what might be outdated. That type of research takes a lot more time. Where if you're just talking about like big ideas or things that you want people to really understand, the research process can oftentimes be relatively quick. And so looking for example, statistics or numbers to kind of support your ideas or points are relatively easy things to do. Um, Now, another thing I like to do is researching what other people have written about the topic and kind of seeing how either I'm different or how I can link to other people's ideas or articles to kind of support the idea that I'm trying to put out there. And so a big part of the research process is oftentimes just reading other people's materials and to kind of see like, okay, does this support my idea? Like, what are some of the ideas that I can borrow from them, and give credit to as well to see like, to incorporate some of the thinking that I have or even improve the thinking and process and argument that I have for what I'm trying to put out there. And so again, it can take anywhere from 20 minutes to up to 45 minutes in my own experience.
One thing that happens to me sometimes is I'm researching and I'll have like a bunch of different browser tabs open. As you're researching, you open more and more and more and more tabs, and which is fine if you're in the active researching part. But if I ever need to interrupt that, like maybe it's time for me to shut down for the day, or I have to go or something like that, there's a Chrome extension that I don't have turned on all the time, but I do have turned on when I'm doing research, and it's called One Tab. And what that will let you do is collect all of your open tabs together into one particular page, I guess you would call it, which organizes everything. So you can then go back and reference that and don't have to have 50 browser tabs open. So if you're ever in that situation where you've got a bunch of tabs open, you might want, and you're a Chrome user, I'm not sure if it's for other browsers as well, check out One Tab. It's really, really handy. I'm sure there's an alternative for Safari as well. All right, so that's researching. Now let's get to the actual act of writing. And so that is our third strategy, which is our third phase, which is writing. Now, for me personally, most of my writing is in an app called Ulysses. That's what I like to use. It's kind of a larger writing app. It's unfortunately Mac and iOS only, another tool, but the cross-platform alternative is called Scrivener. A lot of people who write larger works really like writing in Scrivener. I personally use Ulysses because it's lightweight, it's fast, it looks really nice, and I use it to write documents, blog posts, email newsletters, podcast ads. Almost anything that isn't a quick one-off is generally going to start at least in Ulysses. And I like it because it has lots of exporting options. I can export to HTML if it's going to be something that's maybe a blog post or something like that, or I can export it to PDF or Word, to Google Docs. And it supports kind of like a Markdown, which is kind of like a nerdy web writing language that I personally use. So it has support for that as well. So I like writing in Ulysses. I make heavy use of Text Expander, which we've talked about multiple times on the podcast, which lets you make shortcuts for frequently used text. So I use that all day, every day. And sometimes what I'll do is if it's a large writing project, I mentioned earlier about how MindNode can export. So what I'll do is I'll export out of MindNode into Ulysses, and then I will have my outline, I guess you would say, all there ready for me. So I'm not starting from a blank page. I'm starting from my mind map, which can be really, really helpful. I know earlier in the live stream, Andy says that he does something like that similarly in Rome, which is a tool he uses. He mind map, or not mind map, he outlines it out in Rome, which is a really popular writing and note-taking tool as well. And then he'll build off of that outline right from Rome. For me, though, sometimes the hardest part when I write, this is going to sound funny, the hardest part isn't the content, it's the introduction. So when I get stuck on an introduction, I don't sit there grinding on it. What I'll then do is I'll kind of start in the middle. So I'll write the meat of the whatever it is that I'm writing first, and then I'll loop back and do the introduction or the conclusion after. And I find that sometimes that can be really helpful, because sometimes where you start writing is not where the, the piece of writing ends up. So sometimes it can be helpful to start in the middle and then loop back. That's something that's been really effective for me. How about you, Ten? Do you have any writing tips?
It's funny you say that, because I find the introduction also the most difficult to write. So it's one of the last pieces that I tend to fill up and write about. So, like you, I like to start in the middle and just talk about the main message that I'm trying to share. So, what's the big idea? What's the one big takeaway that everyone should have from reading this article or this email that I'm writing to someone, or this course introduction, or whatever I'm writing about? Anytime you do any form of writing, I think the most effective way of writing is to come from a place of, hey, this is the one big idea that I need you to understand. Okay. Sure, you can make like different points and everything else, but especially when it comes to something like a blog post or a piece of content that you're writing, always think about what's the one main idea. If you think about a book oftentimes has like one major idea as well, right? If you think about, for example, the productivity book, Eat That Frog, there's like one big idea there. If you look at the book, something like Essentialism, there's one big idea there as well. Now, however, if you read something like The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, there's like 7 bigger ideas that are in there collapsed into one, book, but it's all about how to be more productive as a person, right? And so anytime you do any form of writing, think about what's the big idea that I'm trying to communicate. And then anything that you write down is just in support of that main message. And so then I start to think about, okay, what are some of the stories that I want to share that support that big idea? What is an analogy? What's an example? And especially when it comes to examples, I want to use examples that people can relate to. And when you're writing specifically for people, one of the things that I find really helpful is, so in Confluence, which is our internal wiki, we have a page called Customer Avatar. And so before I start writing, I always like to look at that avatar. So I kind of have an idea of, okay, this is the person that I want to write towards. This is the person who needs to get this. And so, for example, if I'm writing to, we actually have 2 avatars. They're named Scott and Lisa. And if you're listening, you probably have an idea who I'm talking about. And so, because these are people I've worked personally with. And so if I think about, okay, who are Scott and Lisa? They are people who are like in the late 30s, mid 40s, people who have families, people who have a very successful corporate career, people who love personal developments, are always consuming and learning books, audiobooks, or are going to conferences or taking seminars or courses to improve their lives. They're investing a lot of time and money in their ongoing education. And if you're listening to this right now, you go, oh, that's me. Well, it took us a lot of time to kind of flesh out, who that avatar was. But once we kind of got an idea, it makes the writing really easy, because now you can make it very conversational, and you can use examples that people can relate to. Okay. So oftentimes when I write about examples, I want to use examples that Scott and Lisa would encounter in their day-to-day lives. So for example, if I'm talking about, going grocery shopping, I want to use examples that they can relate to, right? Now, if I'm using examples of Tan being the single guy who, lives his life in a major city, talking about his dating life or whatever, that, I mean, people can kind of grasp it, but it doesn't really relate to them because most people who follow our content are already married and have kids. And so we want to make sure we use examples that they can relate to, right? So it's not really about me. At the end of the day, I'm writing for you. And so when you start to take that position as well to say, hey, this is not about me, this is all about you, you want to speak to them, you'll start to oftentimes notice like a really simple thing or ratio to think about is like, how oftentimes are you using the word I versus you? And oftentimes the ratio is more in favor of you rather than I, because at the end of the day, when someone's reading something, all they care about is themselves. It's not really about the other person, right? How does this relate to me? How is this going to help me? And so when you have a big idea and you're trying to support it, write it in a way that makes people see that this is something that's relevant for them. So use stories, analogies that relate to them, right? Having an avatar is really helpful. And so when I'm writing something, I make it as conversational as possible. So I, again, start in the middle. And then once I kind of have it fleshed out, I will then um, end with the conclusion. And one of the things we're known for at AE is to make things simple and actionable. So I always want to make sure that things end with something that you can take action on. What's like the one big idea, and what's the one step that you can take at the end to take action on it? Because it's one thing to really grasp it conceptually. It's another thing to be able to say, okay, let's take this first step into the direction that I need to go to get to the destination, right? Which is oftentimes the big idea itself. As far as like the writing process itself, then, you know, going back to the intro, that's something I will write almost second to last. And then the thing I actually have to spend more time on oftentimes is the headline or the title, because oftentimes I think we're all familiar with the concept of headline readers. Some people just read headlines and they pretend to know what's going on in the world and what's going on in their local community, whether they're actually reading the article, right? So the headline or the title makes a big difference. Whether you draw people in or not, right? And so spending some time learning how to write compelling headlines or interesting headlines is a valuable trait and something that I like to spend more time on as well. So if I, you know, had to divvy up my time, I would maybe spend, you know, 2 hours writing, but I definitely spend 30, 40 minutes or just thinking, brainstorming, trying out different titles to draw people in to make sure that they read this. And so those are some of the best practices I have around writing.
By the way, that headline tip is a really great example because you don't really think of it this way, but almost all of our writing that we do, the headline or subject line can be really, really important. And this is especially if you're working in a corporate and you're sending internal emails. If a lot of people, I mean, we've all received emails internally that with the subject line like question or what do you think, or you know, some really not very useful subject line. If you give some thought, if you're sending an internal email and you want it, well, external also, and you want it to be read, give some thought to your subject line. What is it that would be helpful for this person? What is it that would entice this person to open it? And if you just spend a little bit of time on that, even for an internal email, it's going to really, really make it much more likely that you're going to get the action that you're looking for, even just by focusing on the headline. So great tip. All right. So we're done our writing now. Now we move into the next phase, which is the review and edit phase. And this is something that, again, the more I've skipped, sometimes it's tempting to just like finish writing and just be like, okay, I'm done, spell check, and it's good, I'm done. But I have always found that if I come back to something after I write it, Anne Lamott talks about this in her book Bird by Bird, is the concept of the first draft is usually not very good. But if you return to it, then you can always make it better. And same things in that Stephen King book. You can always, always, always make it better. There's always something you can cut out. There's always a better way to say something. So the more you write, the more you'll realize how important reviewing and editing is, not just for grammar, but for clarity as well. So how about you, Tan? When you are finished a piece of writing, quote unquote finished, what is your like editing process?
Yeah, so I always like to do it the next day or at least not do the writing and reviewing on the same day, because oftentimes being able to sleep on something is such a weird but powerful way to kind of think about your article that you just wrote and think about ways you can make it better and even more easier to consume. And so if you're writing something on Monday, you're fleshing it out on Tuesday, and you're like done with it, I would say then wait till Wednesdays, just sleep on it, and then finish it up the next day. And one of the things I found to be really helpful, this is such a funny, silly thing, and I hope you do it while no one is around. But when you're finished writing, read it out loud. So literally, as you're reading your blog post, read it out loud to yourself. And as you're doing that, you start to realize like certain sentences don't make any sense, or you start to see, oh, this is something I would never say, or this doesn't sound conversational whatsoever. If it's something that you want to, make sure of. And oftentimes when I read it out loud, I see a lot of grammar mistakes. I see a lot of typos that I normally would never see. And so that's one of the easiest things you can do, but it's just honestly a little bit annoying to be honest, because if you write like a 5,000 word piece, reading it out loud could take like 15, 20 minutes or something like that, right? Because it's slower than just reading. But I find that you just come up with so many different ways to improve the article. Again, you find hidden typos, grammar mistakes. You can find ways to make it more succinct. So definitely read it out loud. As annoying as it might be, you'll start to notice that it will make your writing so much better. Anytime I do it, and I think I shouldn't be, but I still do it, I notice like, oh man, I this piece is like garbage. I could have made it so much better. So I'm glad I always do it when I do it. So that's one thing. Once you've done that, one of the things I like to do next is run it through Grammarly. So again, they were a sponsor. This is actually how we originally found out about them. And even though they're not sponsoring today's episode, I do find that tool very helpful, and I still use it to this day. To find typos and other misspelled words, just in case I might have missed it, right? So, for example, every now and then the word then, THEN or AN, can be misused, right? And oftentimes when you're reading it very quickly, you might not see it, but something like Grammarly can quickly spot that and show you to fix that. But also it will find other ways to make your sentences more succinct. So always run it through Grammarly. Is literally just like going to it in a URL, right? Because it's a web-based tool. You just paste in your article, let it scan for like 10 seconds, and we'll find all these suggestions for you to make. So it's really quick and easy. Definitely worthwhile doing. Like the old school way used to be, putting it in Microsoft Word, right? Remember those days? And then you would look for the little red squiggle. But now I would use Grammarly for something like that. And then once you're done with that, then it's off to publishing.
Yeah, I find whenever possible, and it's never, or it's not always possible, but when it is possible, just leaving that day or so between phases is so helpful and powerful. And I mean, I should have mentioned this earlier, but in a perfect world, I would be like, brainstorm one day, research and maybe write the next day, and then review and edit the next day, leaving a day in between that gap. You just think, even when you're not thinking about it, ideas just like percolate in your mind, and you'll come back the next day with a totally different and better approach, just having overnight to think about it. So it's not always possible, but when it is possible, I always benefit from it. And yeah, same thing with me on Grammarly. I like to spring for the premium version because not only does it catch all those grammar things that you mentioned, but it always has really strong suggestions for, hey, you should word this a different way. Hey, these words are not really necessary in this sentence. Maybe you should cut them. And at first I'm like, you roll into your editing phase feeling pretty good about your writing, and then you go through and Grammarly tells you all the things that you should change, and you're like, oh yeah, I guess this wasn't so great in the first place. It's so much better after it. So if you have a human editor that can do that, that's even better. But if you don't, a tool like Grammarly with actual grammar suggestions is really, really powerful. All right, Tan. So if somebody wants to do more writing, and one thing I would say is the best way to improve your writing, this is something we tell people internally at the team as well, the only way that you can improve your writing is to write more. You can read books, you can listen to podcasts, all that stuff is really, really helpful. But really, the only way you will ever improve as a writer is to do more and more writing. So even if it's rough at the beginning, just keep doing it, even if no one else ever reads it, and you will get better and better and better over time. So if somebody does want to get better and better over time, Tan, how should we leave things off? What action items should people take?
Yeah, as always, we want to make sure that things are simple and actionable for you, right? Everything that we do at Asian Efficiency is all about that. So if you made it this far, one of the things that I would suggest you do next is think about the 4 phases that we just talked about, right? We talked about the brainstorm phase, we talked about the research, we talked about the writing process, and then the review and editing. What's one of the phases that you need to work on most? You probably have some shape or form one of these already, or maybe you're missing one of these and you should be adding one of those in. But if you do have all 4 of them already, where's one tweak that you can make today to make your writing process a little better? Now do that next and give that a try for at least a week. And anytime you make an improvement there and it sticks, implement the next thing that we talked about today. And if you do that consistently, I guarantee you your writing will get a lot better on top of just writing more, as Brooks just mentioned. Again, we will have links to everything that we discussed today in the show notes. You can go to theproductivityshow.com/346. And next week's episode is all about how we get into a flow state. And if you want to learn how to become more productive, definitely go check out that episode. But we also have a quiz that will walk you through how you can become more productive today. And so if you're interested in that, be sure to check out theproductivityshow.com/quiz. And we look forward to having you again next week. And we'll see you next Productive Monday.